I'll start with some 3 key points, which we'll elaborate further during the course of the talk. So first point is really that internet quality of service is an increasingly critical component of the digital divide. Second is it's not as easy to deal with, largely because our knee-jerk reaction to have some kind of command and control approach to set some minimum quality standards, which is more politically, visible and feasible probably, is costly and complicated to actually implement, especially for developing countries. And third, there might be a way out. If we cannot do it directly through quality standards, perhaps we can unleash market incentives through regulation that encourages entry into telecommunication markets. So that's basically the 3 key ideas that I would like everyone to take home. Now, this is the well-known digital divide that most of us know. There are many different types of divides, but this is the difference in access. Okay? So this is ITU's 2017 global estimates. So we see there a large difference between developed countries and least developed countries. So for developed countries, we're already reaching almost more than 80%. Individuals are reporting that they use the internet. But in least developed countries, it's barely above 10%. So that's a huge difference. But the world in general is already almost half are already using the internet. Almost half the world's population are already online. So what does that mean? It means that if access growth continues at the same pace as it is now, then in about 10 to 15 years, we'll see the rest of the world hopefully catching up with developed countries, which means that the next major source of the divide will be quality, basically. So why should we care about quality of service? Just a little anecdote. I had a friend who was about to have an interview, an overseas interview. We have technology. We can video conference. You can talk to people online, but she couldn't because her internet was really bad and it didn't make sense. They simply couldn't connect. They couldn't talk by audio or by video. So even if we have all these wonderful applications, we dream of using, for example, telemedicine to meet UN Sustainable Development Goals. We have better communication facilities and even entertainment, like gaming or electronic trading. Many of these new applications are highly sensitive to quality of service, internet quality of service. So if you don't have the quality, you don't have the access, you're still locked out. You might be online only on paper. You don't actually have it in practice. So that's going to be a very important problem very, very soon. The question is, how do we mitigate that? How do we close that kind of divide? How do we make sure that there's equal access to quality, not just equal access to access? That's actually quite a difficult question. Because what do we mean by quality? There's so many metrics out there that how do we actually approach the problem? What do we track? Okay. So one way to think about it is to think of quality in 3 ways. So you can think of it as reliability of performance, of core services, and of connectivity. So when you say connectivity, how often are there outages? When you say core services, is the domain name service up or down? Do you have access to the email services, etc.? But perhaps the quality of service that we are most familiar with would be network performance. So I'm pretty sure we're all familiar with this concept of speed, internet speed. And we all measure our own internet speed to see if our ISPs are advertising what they are offering to us correctly. So for now, we can choose to focus on network performance. And that's just scratching the surface. Because quality of service is different from quality of experience. So when you measure network performance, it does not necessarily match up with user perception. So there's such a thing as quality of experience. So for purposes of this research, we have to ignore quality of experience for now, because that takes a lot more, a different kind of approach for measurement. You actually have to go out there to the users and see what they are experiencing, counter to what network performance metrics are saying. So these are examples of quality of service parameters. This is from the European Telecommunication Standards Institute. They're the ones, they're the main go-to standards making body in Europe for telecommunications. And they've defined a number of quality of service metrics. 3 of the most famous would be speed. Everyone knows this. It's data transmission rate achieved separately for downloading and uploading. You can have delay. That's half the time in milliseconds needed for a ping. So it's like a ping request. How long do you get to get the response? And you double that, that's the round trip, you call it latency. Then there's packet loss. So basically, how much are you losing when you don't get replies to your ping commands? So these are the most popular types of quality of service metrics. Quality of service and quality of experience are actually correlated. So we don't have to worry that much. What network performance is correlated what users actually experience. Only that software can also improve quality of experience. So there's a lot more variables involved in measuring quality of experience compared to simply quality of service. But even quality of service is kind of difficult to get a handle on as well. Does your ISP have total control over the measurement of quality of service? Not necessarily. So in the house, for example, if you have a lot of people using the same modem, sharing the connection, and then you measure it, you're basically dividing your own connection. So that also impacts what you're gonna, when you go out there and you measure, for example, your speed, that will also impact it. Your Wi-Fi router, your Wi-Fi, for example, your device as well, your operating system. So there are many factors on the user side that can also affect the quality of service metrics. Okay? Then beyond that, you would want to go to your access network, for example, your last mile provider. Okay, they might have control over the infrastructure, if it's fiber, if it's cable, if it's copper. But then beyond them, they might not have a control over your entire quality experience, because your data goes out beyond your access network. So if you're trying to, say, access a website somewhere around the world, on the other half of the world, then your service provider might have control only over a certain network, beyond which they have to pass it on to, say, their peering partners or their transit providers, beyond which they have no control. So end-to-end quality which is what matters to users, really. Because when you're trying to use services, what matters to you is end-to-end quality. But it's hard to take someone to task for something that they have no complete control over. So that's why quality is very contentious, because access networks, ISPs, broadband providers are going to say, yes, that's all good. You're trying to make us improve our quality, but that's unfair because we don't have complete control over everything beyond our own network. So that's part of the issue. In the UK, you're all familiar with SAMNOS, the Ofcom, the UK regulator, quality checker. You can go out there, you can see if you have super fast broadband, etc. But there are actually no actual standards. There are some codes of behavior, codes of practices, but not hard standards to follow. But they do monitor. Perhaps the country that has a very good example of quality standards would be Singapore. And this is an example of quality standards in Singapore. The question is, who do they apply the standards to? So basically, they said that only if you meet a certain market share. So if you're a small ISP, they don't care about you. So they only basically monitor the big three providers. That's Singtel, StarHub, and M1. Basically. So they only monitor the big three players. And they have standards for latency, they have standards for network availability and bandwidth utilization. So they're basically imposing fines on providers if you do not meet these standards. They measure this, they have a measurement infrastructure in place, and they impose fines. Like everything in Singapore, everything is fined. So they impose fines on providers. So this is an example of a standard. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a regulator somewhere in Yemen or Benin, for example. You probably don't have the capability to impose these standards or to have a measurement infrastructure. Italy actually is in the process of having their own measurement infrastructure. They call it Misura Internet in Italy. But it took them like, more than 5 years just to get it going, just to get through all the political processes, get the system out there, get the network operators to say, yes, we can be measured, and consumers can come to us and complain and have their money back if we're not actually meeting the standards. So even a developed country has problems setting up politically and not just resource-wise the measurement infrastructure. So it's not cheap, okay? So what are we saying then? So we are basically seeing these differences, very stark differences in performance. So I'm just choosing one kind of metric, which is connection speed, because this is familiar to everyone. And we'll see that some countries can barely email, basically. So this is in KBPS in 2009. And in 2009, this is using Akamai data. We have South Korea, we have Hong Kong, we have Japan, so that's East Asia. We have Romania and Sweden. Romania is actually a very interesting story because they emerged from behind the Iron Curtain without any regulations. But they had a lot of engineering talent who started cabling up the place. And it was a wild, wild west. And they ended up having fiber ahead of everyone else. Because of that, there were no rules, and people just got used to fast connections. Not that they have a lot of people who are connected, but if you are connected, you have something that's really good quality. And then Sweden. And then this picture changed in 2016. But we still have South Korea there. and now it's Norway and Sweden. Hong Kong is still there, and now it's Switzerland. So the darker, the faster it is. And again, this is in kbps, so which means that the fastest would be 27 Mbps in measured speed in 2016. Now, there are many measurement sources for quality of service. You can choose user-driven metrics. You can have, for example, you have UCLA, but it's not open source. You have to pay for that. But they used to give it out for free, but they don't anymore. The European Internet Registry, RIPE, has a very good big data set that measures network performance. But they don't have a good representation worldwide yet. There's also the Google Princeton Consortium called Measurement Labs. And they used to have a very good global sample, but it seems that there's less people using their testing mechanism. But they do, it's open source, so you can access the data via BigQuery. It's on Google Tables, so you can get it if you want. I choose to use the Akamai dataset for a very specific reason. One, they have very good global representation. It's a content development content delivery network. And they measure requests through their servers. Very good globally. And at the same time, they weed out the mobile networks. So that's one less complication. So the focus is more on fixed networks, whether it's business or whether it's residential. So that means that we have a lot less to explain, because mobile networks in general are, when we talk about speed or latency, they're generally slower than fixed networks. So if we just focus on fixed networks, then we have a lot less to explain. Now, our interest is on what type of regulation, what type of rules would give us basically better quality. In the literature, there's a lot of talk about unbundling regulations. Have you heard of unbundling, like local loop unbundling? This was a big debate in the UK when it was implemented, largely because it's supposed to give new entrants easier access to the existing infrastructure. The argument was that encourages competition, that encourages investment, and more people will have broadband access. So there's a lot of discussion, theoretical discussion in the OECD on unbundling forms of regulation. But the question is that enough? I mean, can you just stop at unbundling? Can you just look at one kind of regulation? Or maybe you have unbundling, but the effects are canceled by another type of regulation. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to look at the synergy, at the cluster of regulations, to be able to see whether rules are actually more pro or less competitive than they are. So I'm using the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, does an annual survey of regulators. So they send this out to all regulators all over the world. You have a bunch of questions. Do you have these kinds of rules or not? But these rules do not change radically over time. They change quite slowly because of the political process, as you know. But I'm counting 23 indicators, basically 23 types of rules. And they're scored from 0, 1, and 2, depending on their answer, 2 being the most pro-competitive approach to that particular rule. So these are examples. So one would be licensing procedures, simple licensing procedures. Licensing is very crucial. In some countries, you have to get a very complicated franchise just to operate as an internet service provider. That's already a big barrier to entry. So if you're in Africa, you want to be an access network, you can't do that easily, for example. In the Philippines, where I'm from, to be a telco, to be a telecom operator, you have to get the approval of the Senate, the National Senate. That's 23 senators. That's a big cost, you know, if you think about it, basically. So all these barriers to entry prevent firms from actually coming in and setting up shop. So licensing is very important, and then we tend to forget about it. There are also some countries, you know, think about Wi-Fi, for example. Normally, when you talk about the spectrum, it's heavily regulated. You cannot just use it, right? Like, you can't interfere with other people. You can go to jail even, whatever, if you're illegally using the spectrum, for example. But Wi-Fi in the US, for example, was license exempt. What does that mean? To use it, you don't need to go to the FCC and get, you know, approval. Your device just needs to be certified. It just needs to be among the devices that can use the spectrum. That makes things simpler because it moves the burden back to the manufacturers. You just buy it and then you use it. But in many countries, you actually need to get a license to use Wi-Fi or to operate as a Wi-Fi provider. You'll be surprised how many countries there are. I went to Rwanda once, and I realized that you actually need a license to provide Wi-Fi in Rwanda. So in the Philippines, that was true earlier, and then they changed the rules. So licensing procedures, again, is very important. Publication of interconnection offers is also very important, because if you're a new entrant, you get to see what are the prices, what are the mechanisms, what are the rules for interconnecting with incumbents. The other is if you require number portability. So number portability, if you cannot easily change your number, you're stuck with a certain provider. And most of the internet providers are actually formerly telco incumbents. So number portability helps make open the field. The other is mandated infrastructure sharing and co-location. So you usually have rules, like, you know, when you have your servers. So you have rules on how you can connect to the infrastructure of other networks. If that's not clear, then they can play games on you. They can under-provision the interconnection link. This is very common. They will say, oh, but we are interconnected. But how big is the pipe? How big is the interconnection? And then you have local loop unbundling, which is people are very familiar with. But then another important thing is the existence of a competition authority. Many countries don't have competition authorities. And they don't even have antitrust rules as well. So that also matters. Then the other is, and this might seem strange, but restrictions on foreign participation and ownership. Why would this be important? Because telecommunication is capital intensive. And often in certain countries, you don't have enough capital locally. So you would need to bring it in. So if you have the threat of foreign entry, that makes the market actually more competitive, even if it's just a threat, not real foreign entry. So how do countries look like in terms of their pro-competition score? So we add all that up, they get a maximum score of 46. So 46 is like the most pro-competitive country. But then we see that there's country that's actually 1 in the score. That's Benin. And in 2016, so notice a big difference in 2009 and in 2016. Which country changed? Mexico had a big reform in 2015, very big, you know. It was designed to, as Carlos Slim once said, who is like, you know, one of the richest men in the world, he felt like he was being expropriated. You know, like the government went out there and, you know, took back his investments. So it was a major telecommunication reform in Mexico, designed to open up the market. So they introduced more pro-competition pro-competition rules. So we should be seeing some results from Mexico in the future. So just to, just a bit of like initial analyses, like we're just gonna focus, for example, on connection speed. Does pro-competition rules really matter in terms of improving average connection speed? We have to control for a number of things. We have to control for demand characteristics, so that's why we include GDP. We have to control for population. Why do we have to control for population? Because the engineering cost of setting up a network is lower in more populated centers, in more urban, more dense centers. So the higher the population density, the more urban a country is, then the lower it costs to actually build out the network. So the infrastructure cost is actually lower. The other thing, we also try to see if actual competition matters. So since we don't have data on market shares for all broadband providers, what we did is we looked at platform competition. How diverse is the platforms? Do they have cable? Do they have fiber? Do they have copper? Do they have fixed wireless? Do they have satellite? Or do they just have cable? Or do they just have copper? So the more diverse, the more competitive it is, okay? So we do see, at least, even when we control for other factors, we control for unobserved factors as well, we see that the pro-competition regulation score actually matters. So competition does matter in terms of quality. So I guess to end the discussion, I'll end with a quote from Oliver Williamson, who said that regulation can serve to infuse confidence into otherwise problematic trading relations. Because you're wondering, why would competition actually improve quality? It could have two pathways: investment and interconnection, basically. How does it impact investment? How does it impact interconnection? So in network economics, the traditional view is that you always have the incentive to interconnect because there are network externalities. You hurt the other, you hurt yourself, basically. If you don't interconnect, you're destroying your own quality. That's the usual argument. But you can also play games with each other. You know, if you're big enough, you're bigger than the other network rival, you can hurt yourself. You can take the pain of reduced interconnection quality just to disadvantage your rival. So there are many games that networks can play with each other that could affect, in the end, quality. You know. So anyway, thank you for listening, and